Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces. Nice to see some new faces. Welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to share the intention behind this panel. So we're bringing you today a conversation that is inspired by CPDP's first ever Black-led panel from last year, a powerful reminder of what happens when the margins are moved to the center. It's also shaped by the thought leadership of Janine, a policy advisor at EDRI, who can't make it today with us, unfortunately, and whose work continues to push for a more holistic, empowerment-focused approach to digital rights. Today, we're bringing a critical, youth-led perspective, one that is rarely given a space in spaces like this. But let me be clear, this is not a side panel, and it's certainly not a kids' table. Whether you work with youth or not, this conversation is one you need to hear. The insights that will be shared here are just as strategic, complex, and essential as any other insights you heard or you will continue hearing throughout this conference. I also want to offer a small disclaimer that some of what we will discuss might feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you come from a dominant group, such as being white, cisgender, middle-aged, or male. That discomfort is not a threat. It's an invitation to sit with, reflect on, and listen deeply. But before we dive into that, let me take a moment to lend you into this space. So I will invite you to kindly, if you feel like it, close your eyes. We're going to take a deep breath, and then we're going to go back to the context. So on my count, please gently close your eyes, if you're sitting, of course, and if you feel like joining. In 3, 2, 1, take a deep inhale. And now exhale. One more time. You can take a deep inhale. And now exhale. Now bring yourself back to me. And back to today's political climate, where being young is already hard. And it becomes even harder when you are not from the dominant group. And I say that not just as a passionate young activist or human rights defender, but I also say that as a vulnerable, anxious individual navigating the world as a queer, racialized migrant. For many of us, digital spaces were once places to build community, explore identity, and feel a sense of belonging. But that promise has been replaced by a battlefield where online safety is debated and decided on our behalf, often without us in the room. We are seeing governments adopt restrictive top-down approaches, banning youth from social media under the guise of protection, or pushing laws like the UK's Online Safety Act that do more harm than good. These policies rarely reflect our realities. And too often, they reinforce control rather than care. My name is Yassine. I use they, he pronouns. I am the chair of IGLIO, as well as the anti-racism panel coordinator in there. And today I am honored to moderate this conversation with the brilliant panel of speakers. Together we'll be unpacking what it means to exist and resist in digital spaces, especially for those of us who have long been defaulted as minorities, when in fact we represent a powerful majority driving the future of digital rights. A future that starts now and that starts here in this panel. So welcome, and please help me welcome our panelists, Steffi, Rita, Luisa, and Manon. And to kick things off, I'd love to invite each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and share with us, what is your personal relationship with online spaces? What do they mean to you in your work, the communities you belong to, you serve, in your activism, or in your everyday life? The floor is yours.
Hi everyone. My name is Luisa Franco Machado. I'm a Brazilian digital rights activist and the founder of Equilabs, a youth-led, global majority-centered digital rights lab that's reframing digital policy and AI with an intersectional perspective. I think for me, it's interesting because as Gen Z, I don't really see online spaces as something you go to disconnect. I see it as really connected and entrenched with my own personality and my existence in this world. I exist in online spaces, I resist in online spaces, and these spaces make what I am today. At the same time, I feel both the subject and the actor because I'm also researching these spaces. I'm also working on policy, digital policy. So it's an interesting relationship that feels very political and very intimate as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Steffi, pronouns she, her. I work for Equinox Initiative for Racial Justice, which is a queer, racialized, feminist organization working on the intersection of racial justice, gender justice, and global justice struggles. My personal relationship with online spaces, I would say, in a word, unhealthy. I have been described as chronically online with a 40-hour-a-week screen time on TikTok. And in terms of activism, I think we've all seen how important online activism is, how important online community is, and how these are so often the kind of vanguard of creative, disciplined, and brave actions and movements and people.
Hi everyone. This is on, yes. Hi everyone, my name is Manon. I work at Five Rights Foundation. We are a children's rights organization, so we aim at ensuring that the digital world is actually built and designed with and for children. And I think as to my personal relationship with the online environment, I see it very much as a human space rather than a tech space, and I hope we can keep it this way, but I also think it's a space that embeds a lot of the power asymmetries that we see in the world, and where a lot of people are earnestly excluded, and not only children. But I also think it's a space of great opportunities as well, and I hope that together, we can try to entangle how to make sure that that becomes really that space for everyone, and most notably for children, because I think, they are one of the groups that have maybe the most to lose, but also, the most to gain from the online environment. And maybe just to share a bit of a reflection, but I'm not a child anymore, as you can probably tell, but I think working as Five Rights has been a great way to kind of reflect on my personal experience when I was a teen. And yesterday we were talking about digital fairness, and somebody from a consumer organization was actually saying that a lot of consumers don't actually realize that, what they're dealing with are dark patterns or persuasive designs, but they feel this sense of it's unfair. And I think when I was a teen, I could sense that, some of the stuff I had to deal with were not fair. And, working at Five Rights now, it's kind of a great privilege to have the concept to actually be dealing with those things and try to provide for solutions.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Rita. I am the Arts and Personhood Lead at Build Up, which is an NGO that works on peace building and conflict resolution, a lot in the digital space as a space of conflict and using technologies in traditional peace building projects. So actually my relationship to the online space is very limited. I am almost in no social media, or I didn't used to be. I have WhatsApp, and now I have Signal. And I mostly use it to communicate with my family and my friends, because I've been moving a lot, and it's one of the only ways that I get to maintain those relationships. But most of my work happens online. And most of my work is about how the online and the offline, if we can even call it that way, constantly interact and affect each other. So I actually recently reopened my Instagram for small activism purposes, or big. And I'm trying to, again, figure out what I want from it. But it's not as a clear or, relationship.
Fair. Well, is it on? Yeah. Well, I know, Rita, you don't like spotlight, but I'm going to put you in a spotlight to start with you and to get this powerhouse started. So first things first, young people are often invited into digital policy and governance spaces, whether governmental, corporate, or civil society, as symbols rather than decision makers. Their involvement is frequently limited to consultation or visibility without real influence over outcomes. So Rita, what does it mean to our movement and our capacities? And what are the risks of this symbolic inclusion, and how do we ensure young people retain ownership of their ideas in these spaces?
Great, thank you. What an honor to start. I'm also a bit nervous, but okay. So I think that, to be honest, when Yassine did send us the questions in advance, because they did, I actually really struggled to think. I'm like, why do I have to talk about youth again? Like, why do I have me to say things about this particular topic that I know mostly because I am young still? But then, of course, I thought of things, because you always think of things. And I think that one of the like questions that kept coming up in my head as I tried to unpack the question, Yassine, was precisely the problem is that we feel like we need to retain ownership. We have ownership. Whenever we show up in spaces, it's because we're invited. We feel included. And therefore, by this whole relation of someone that invites and someone that is invited, you immediately have an extractive relationship with the other group of people, right? Our ideas are extracted. And I think if we were part of creating those programs, those policies, those projects, especially when they're about us from the beginning, we wouldn't have to retain any ownership because we would have it. We would also hold responsibility, but the ownership of holding that space from the beginning is one that I think is often not given to any marginalized or groups that usually don't hold power. And with that, I always like to refer to a quote by the disability rights movement that they always said, "Nothing about us without us is for us." So whenever we're thinking of a policy, whenever we're thinking of a project, in peace building, we're super guilty of this as well. But whenever we're thinking about things that we want a certain specific group to be involved in, they have to be part of this us. They're not a they anymore. Well, that's one. Then I think something else that I was thinking about is how this symbolic inclusion causes a lot of competition between us. When you create young ambassadors, when you create boards, then we need to compete with each other in order to get to those spaces. And then we feel shiny. We feel like we need to represent. We feel like we have the weight of all of these people and the communities of young people around the world. I don't know what most of them were doing when we were all younger, because we come from very different contexts. So I think that we have to find new ways of thinking about getting those voices in a way that is not about highlighting one person. Or if that person is highlighted, that the community that they come from chooses who they want in that space and not the people that are in power. And then two quick things. One is that I think we need to be trusted. People often are like, oh, you have so many years to live, you have so much experience to have. Yes, but when it comes to the digital space and digital technologies, we've grown up with them. We've grown up in them as well. So I think that, of course, we don't know everything. I think sometimes also young people are like, oh, but we know. Some things we don't know. But there are things that people that are not young anymore also don't know, and that we know. So I think that in that sense, the constant idea of talking across these divides, intergenerationally, even, inter-youth, inter-context are so important. And they need to trust that if we say, this is what I want a specific feature that tells me this, is for a reason. And the last quick point is that I think it comes back to what we were saying about that nothing about us without us is for us, is the idea that who gets to ask questions, who gets to ask how we frame a conversation. And I think that often, this is from experience, we recently were doing a project after some heavy youth protests that happened on trying to establish a conversation between these youth protesters and the government using deliberative technology, which are these technologies that now are very in the rise for like fostering civic engagement. And from the beginning, when we were setting up this project, we said, oh, but what does the government want to ask youth? What do they want to know about what they're complaining? But no youth would have come into that space because they don't want to answer, they want to ask. We want to say to the government, this is what we think, and this is what you need to think about. So I think the most important, coming back to the idea of like participatory processes, is from that beginning, who gets to shape the questions, the programs, the policy? Because the questions are what let us imagine what the answers would be. Thanks.
Thank you. I feel like just to jump into that point and just like sort of a connection, this morning I went to a roundtable that was supposed to be led by youth and for youth, and the topic was youth in digital spaces. And the conversation was like, do we need more research? And I'm like, why do we need more research? We need to look at who is doing those research, who is shaping those questions? Because like if it's still the same people who are doing those research and only consulting with people, then we keep going back to falling under tokenism and not being under the motto of nothing for us without us. And I'm like, not only work for youth, but work with youth, within the youth sector, not just by jumping into and asking them and then leaving. But to build on this tokenism conversation, youth are often spoken about, especially in EU digital spaces, as a single neutral category. This framing ignores how racialized, migrant, and refugee young people experience harm differently or are excluded entirely from these conversations. As someone working closely with these communities, Steffi, how does this homogenized idea of youth in the EU harm racialized and displaced young people? And why are their experiences still treated as an external or secondary in digital rights and tech governance spaces?
Thanks, Yassine. Well, it's kind of like what Rita was already saying, that the only thing for certain that all young people have in common is that they fall into a certain age range and that they live under the tyranny of adult supremacy. That's literally where the commonalities end. This homogenized idea of youth, treating any group of people like a monolith, whether that's in tech, whether that's in policymaking, turns very, very quickly into an I don't see color, I don't see gender, two-dimensional flattening of given experience, and that's even before you bring in class, orientation, language, accessibility, things like that. And the real impact of that is that a huge amount of people are completely invisibilized, and that, of course, has consequences on their use and enjoyment of the online world. I'd invite maybe everybody in this conference to interrogate themselves on when they think about safety, what they mean by that, and what they think about youth, who they picture. I think when the majority of people think of at-risk youth online, they're thinking about young white people at risk of developing eating disorders or falling down an incel pipeline. And while those are extremely valid and necessary to deal with, I'm here specifically to speak about, like you said, the racialized youth experience online, which is mostly forgotten. And that's mostly because most tech platform developers are also white and also not young. They're designing from the standpoint of their own experience, the white perspective. And we know already that tech entrenches what exists already in society, so the systemic racism and biases that are present there. And when technology is developed without these communities in mind, of course, it excludes them by design. Tech is not some kind of magical, neutral, omnipotent, like, thing, and it's used everywhere, meaning these impacts fall into healthcare, schools. Like, there's no such thing as online as a contained space anymore. It's about every facet of life, and most crucially, criminal justice as well. Sorry, forgot to mention that. And the reason that this is allowed to continue is because of the economic model of big tech. Thanks for having us, by the way. Corporations very, very clearly benefit materially from discrimination, from exclusion, from polarization, whether that's to sell you more stuff or to increase, the hours you spend online outraged or attacking other people. That's when you end up with suggestions that policymakers are trying to address a system that is kind of wrong from the beginning, and suggesting things like ID verification to have your accounts with using a real photo of yourself or your real name, assuming that anonymity breeds insecurity when actually it provides safety for a lot of minorities, including racialized youth, undocumented youth, queer youth, activist youth, young women and girls who often face the most risks of direct harassment online. And so, really what I'm asking people to interrogate is what they think of, what they mean by young people, and what they mean by safety. Safety for whom? Safety from whom?
From whom? Oh my God, yes. Yeah, that deserves a round of applause. Still in the same rabbit hole of who's making the decision on behalf of who, and adults and institutions deciding on what's best for communities, children are often excluded from shaping the policies meant to protect them. Tools like age verifications are introduced in their name, but often violate their privacy and treat them as risk rather than rights holders. Manon, how do we see this practice? And what would it look like to protect children in ways that are empowering, privacy-respecting, and co-designing with them?
Thank you so much for the question. And I think I might build a bit on what Rita and Steffi were saying earlier. And maybe also what you mentioned at the beginning, that, we are not the kids' table, but I think in some ways we should go and sit at the kids' table. We should go and ask them how they're living their experiences online. What does it feel? Because I think, there's a lot of misconceptions as adults and as, people actually doing those technologies about what's the lived experiences of people, right? And you need to go and actually ask them, like, how they're living those experiences, what tools they need, how can you actually best protect them? And to do that, you need to go and ask them. And I think, for children, they have this right? Like, under the UNCRC, you have a right as a kid to, be heard and participate in any kind of decisions that actually concerns you. So we need to make sure that those rights are actually properly applied, whether it concerns the digital environment or any other kind of environment. And maybe then coming back to your question per se, so what do we think in terms of excluding children as a solution? It's not, right? It's not a solution, but I think I also want to come back to why this solution is actually being picked up as the solution. I think there is a lot of frustration, and I'm sure a lot of people share that frustration in the room regarding, big tech technologies or technologies and digital services and product in general, and the model in which they are built, right? Which is a lot of data extraction, it's persuasive design, and that leads to, children spending too much time online, children having to deal with eating disorders, which is one of the examples you mentioned, but also sexual abuse, issues, concerning commercial exploitations, influencers. So many of those problems, right? And I think there is this growing frustration of like, what do we do about it? And sometimes this easy solution seems to be, let's just stop it altogether and just, exclude children, right? But I think there are other solutions, they really are, and you were mentioning maybe a few of them. We were talking about exclusion by design, and that's the key word, right? It's by design. So, the tool for now is not neutral, but it can be made better, and I think that's really where we need to focus our efforts. And in that sense, if I can talk a bit policy, maybe, as what's happening at European level, like we've seen, the DSA coming into force. We have Article 28, which requires a high level of privacy, safety, and security for children. And we are seeing that in the guidelines that were just published by the Commission last week, a lot of the issues that are being touched on are actually design issues. And I think this is where we should start from. If we want to avoid risk, and right now we know that the environment is risky by design, then we need to change the design per se.
Oh my God, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's definitely what we're going to delve into later. So that's a good entry point for that. Thank you. Well, we've been naming various forms of marginalizations, whether it's racialized, migration, or queer and youth. We must also acknowledge how digital policy often stripes these realities of their political weight. Policy language tends to depoliticize harm by framing people as neutral online users, rather than addressing the power structures that shapes their experiences. Louisa, while being fully aware of this, how do you see the practice of depoliticizing harm in digital policy, and why it's important to explicitly name systemic issues like racism, ageism, tokenism, queerphobia, ableism, patriarchy, or neoliberalism in policymaking, and what does that shift enable in practice?
Thank you so much. I think that very interestingly, I think we have to stop pretending that digital policy is a response to harm. Most of the time, it's a response to risk, but risk as defined by those probably least impacted by systemic violence. When the EU talks about systemic risks, or when platforms invest in trust and safety, we're not talking about lived experiences of harm. We're talking about risk to market stability, to brand reputation, to transatlantic relations. Harm is only taken seriously when it disrupts the system, not when it destroys lives. Meanwhile, the ongoing experience from racialized, queer, disabled communities is systematically recoded, treated not really as evidence of structural failure, but really as isolated incidents, as technical anomalies, as operational burdens to be handled downstream, if at all. And I think that this is really a feature of the governance architecture as we know today. I've been inside policy processes where the definitions of safety were finalized before any consultation began, where risk assessments were written in language so abstract, they became meaningless. like ensure proportional mitigation of potential harms based on impact and likelihood. Like no mention of who gets erased, flagged, or permanently invisible. I really recommend you read AI standards. You think that they're talking to no one, literally. And I think that that's literally how harm becomes technocratic and politically diffused. You talked about the UK Online Safety Act. For those of you who don't know, there was this really big thing where it was supposed to hold platforms accountable also for content that isn't illegal but still causes harm, like racist abuse. And that clause was cut after free speech groups pushed back. In Brazil, a bill aimed to tackle disinformation was killed after a disinformation campaign from Google that was ran to all Brazilian users, saying how much the bill was harmful, and then the bill was killed. In AI standards that I was reviewing lately, the term fairness was narrowed to model optimization, not really race, class, gender, power. So really, the assumption that safety could be measured in statistical variance was there, and not really who literally lives or dies in automated systems. That really reminded me of something that Timnit Gebru called out lately when she said, it's funny that when people work on existential threats to AI, they get labeled AI safety. And those of us naming racism, sexism, and surveillance get sidelined as AI ethics. Ethics has a dilemma feel to it. Do you choose this or that? Well, it depends. Safety, however, it's more definitive. Something isn't safe or is safe. So language really changes everything. So what happens when we actually name racism, patriarchy, ageism, neoliberalism? We shift the burden of proof. We stop asking, is this individual piece of content harmful? And we start asking, who benefits from this system of amplification, erasure, and monetization? And that actually unlocks different policy tools, redistributive ones, reparative ones, governance-centered ones. And I'll finish by saying that digital environments, they are political and economic infrastructures. They're not just some, online playgrounds or something like that. And until we treat them this way as political and economic infrastructures, our own safety frameworks will continue serving the system and not the people most harmed by it.
Oh my God, yeah, that also reminds me of the same roundtable that I mentioned earlier, where this morning we're also discussing this sort of, we're all in the AI or like digital rights movement, but we don't have the same values. We're not moving all towards the same political shifts or political agendas, because it's just like a bunch of civil organizations or bodies that are pushing their own agendas, but we are not all moving in the same panel through the same pace. Because, for example, I would prioritize Black trans refugee voices. Another one would just stick to women. And I'm like, are we looking at the whole spectrum? Are we looking at privileges? Are we looking at systemic structures? Are we looking at how this definitely shapes the design? That I don't want to spoil myself and go back there, so I'll keep that. But I will still be around the point that you mentioned about how policies avoid naming powers, and that still affects the outcome. I'd like to come back to you, Steffi. As you know, digital rights often aren't seen as a priority in racialized and migrant communities, not because we don't matter, but because we're excluded from the spaces that shape them. Yet we're constantly impacted. Facial recognition and predictive policing, for example, are banned or restricted in much of the EU, especially when targeting white citizens, but still used widely on racialized and migrant groups. How do these systems specifically target, suppress, and/or criminalize racialized and asylum-seeking youth? And what are the wider consequences, both digitally, physically, when safety technologies are designed to control rather than protect?
Great question, and to put it very, very simply, they target racialized migrant youth because they can, because society does. I loved what you said, Luisa. You said people are living and dying by automation, and it's true. It's not really an exaggeration to say that at all. The use of big data, the use of automation, algorithms, just brings what already exists in society, the systemic discrimination and racism, to a new level. It's faster, becomes more widespread, and you're kind of, all of a sudden, you look around and you're living in a very hostile environment of permanent surveillance for some, not all, but especially for racialized youth, especially in public spaces, which are supposed to be collectively owned, but also in schools, online. And this is all centered around the presumption of criminality. Mostly this criminality that is based on race and class and gender. At the same time, what we have are less safeguards, less opacity, with this kind of very quickly developing technology that is not quickly or appropriately regulated. And that makes it harder to challenge as well. If systemic racism in law enforcement was already a huge problem, when we're going to have robo-cop dogs roaming the streets, I think we can all agree it's going to get significantly worse. Predictive policing will be employed in communities that are already over-policed and under-resourced, and those things are connected. They are mutually exclusive. The same communities don't have money or care because that money is going to cameras and cops. It reinforces this idea of criminality that is linked to certain demographic groups and is basically just, racial profiling on crack. It's based on flawed and inaccurate systems. We all know facial recognition is more effective on a white face than a black face. Emotion recognition very quickly moves us into thought crime areas of predictive policing, where kind of, based on nothing, your potential to commit crime is somehow calculated very, very far away in somebody's back room on some random computer. And the consequences of this is, technology that is designed to control and ends up in mass criminalization, punishment, and incarceration as a first response to what are social issues that target the same communities, with public funds taken away from education or healthcare or social welfare, housing. And what we've seen in the EU is a lack of regulation, especially in high-risk sectors, most notably policing and border control, with little opportunity for redress, and groups like undocumented migrants who are unable to access data privacy protection rights. And then kind of to zoom out a little bit as well in terms of the impact on our societies and democracies more broadly, it's very, very good to remember, again, how profitable automation and control are when tech multinationals and billionaires offer AI services as this kind of catch-all solution to every single problem under the sun. The tech sector spends 113 million euros per year on lobbying in Brussels alone. And we've seen the result very, very clearly, and we will continue to do so in the next EU budget. The entire economy will be reoriented towards policing, surveillance, weapons, defense, to the detriment of largely racialized populations.
What a hard truth and reality to just sit with it. Similar to how hostile technologies and systems that Safi just shared with us, systems are projected onto our physical space too. Schools, streets, or neighborhoods. We see the same logics embedded in the design of digital platforms. Spaces that should offer refuge for marginalized youth are instead shaped by control, from shadow banning and algorithmic erasure to content takedowns and surveillance. Rita, how can we better understand the risks and harms baked into the very design of these platforms, especially when viewed through the diverse lived experiences of racialized, queer, migrant, and other marginalized young people? What can we do about it?
Thank you. I think words weigh a lot, so I'm still feeling them, but thank you so much for everything you've spoken. Before I answer, I would like to differentiate between two concepts when we talk about tech. One of them is digital affordances. So digital affordances refer to what digital technologies enable. So how information is produced, distributed, and experienced online. These affordances shape not just what content appears, but how it travels and how we see it. So digital affordances. And then we have digital harms. So digital harms is the damage that is intentional, sometimes incidental, that results from these affordances. And it's not just what's said, but how platforms make it viral, target it, or suppress it. So the digital affordance I would like to focus on as I answer this question is algorithmic amplification, and the harm is polarization, affective polarization, or toxicity, whatever you want to call it. So I think this also comes again from what we're talking, it's by design. In order to reduce these risks and this harm that come from these digital affordances, we need to look upstream. I love, there's a quote, something that Maria Ressa said once, that she said, if there is a factory and there's a polluted river, the factory is polluting the river, it doesn't make a lot of sense to get like bits of water, try to clean them and put them back into the river, but you need to go up to the factory, shut down that factory, and then clean the river. So this is just a bit of a testament to how we need to go up there and change how platforms are designed. Not to say that content moderation or their thinking of it is also important, but it's a bit of a testament to going up there or in there, in the code, and changing how things are done. Because we all know that disagreements on digital platforms spiral out of control, and we know who profits from it. And as well, in the peace building and mediation field, we also know that that spiraling out of control, actually whether it's online or offline, happens when disagreements become about people rather than about ideas. And that is the idea of effective polarization, right? We can disagree, and disagreeing is good. But when I start to target a whole group of homogeneous people because of a belief, that's when it becomes very problematic. And that's also when digital platforms profit from it. Because that spiraling out of control of disagreement, it's kind of what captures attention online. It creates engagement, and therefore it creates profit. So the attention, engagement, profit make money. There's no incentive for platforms to change that. Online violence many times goes to offline violence as well. And I think that in conflict spaces, for marginalized groups, or for anyone that is trying to push a non-dominant narrative on an online platform, this has disastrous consequences. Like most of us, or any one of us that have tried, I would say peace, even if to some of us it is, peace is not very sexy for platforms and for social media. It's not what catches people. People want to comment, people want to disagree, people like things that are a bit controversial, and that just makes it that most of us seen it. So content sometimes that we put forward is not seen, but content that is about us and that is harmful, sometimes we see in our everyday feeds. And I think that that's just something it's a harm that is produced by these algorithms. So basically, we talk a lot about basically how can we change that? There's no incentives if the market incentives are profit. But we are trying. So actually what I wanted to briefly say is that we are actually in the process of measuring a polarization footprint. So we've started thinking about polarization as a negative externality of platforms, much like CO2. If a factory is producing chairs and tables, CO2 emissions happen. That's not what they want, but it is what happens. Platforms actually most of the times have that. The algorithms are designed in the way, in the beginning they didn't want to have this idea of polarizing people, but now it's become a negative externality. Therefore, how can we measure it in order that it becomes an incentive for platforms to actually change the way that their business models and their market works? Because if it's not profitable for them, probably they won't want it anymore. So actually we're doing it, we're on it. We're trying to build a replicable polarization footprint method by measuring specifically 3 things. The prevalence of posts with attitude polarization, then the acceptance of such attitude, it's called norm polarization, are there comments that counter it, do people agree with it, what's going on? And the third one is the degree of sorting, so interaction polarization. This whole idea, I think we used to talk before about echo chambers, now we're beginning to shift into who actually, if I like some things and Manon likes some things, who does that get to the next people in the panel? So we're measuring these 3 different things, a bit with an idea to actually bring this to regulators, and to do this to better understand actually what are people seeing in their feeds, how does that affect them, and try to build an incentive for platforms not to be able to ignore that they should do this for their own good, not for us, just for them.
Oh, I'm just like in awe with the design conversation. I think it's the root, and definitely we should go back to those roots. But now, besides those roots, we're going back to Luisa. You've worked across governments in the UN and civil society, often from inside the very room where digital governance frameworks are negotiated. We're seeing more and more cases where the far-right actors use a kind of Uno reverse card to undermine rights-based regulation, framing enforcement against hate speech or disinformation as censorship. While they themselves weaponize digital spaces with impunity. At the same time, many digital policies are built through processes that exclude the very communities they claim to protect, and are often weakened by poor enforcement and political compromise. From your experience, what do current policy-making processes get wrong, and how do we redesign them to ensure that digital governance is not just protective on paper, but enforceable globally, relevant, and resistant to co-optation?
I think from where I sit, having worked alongside governments, with UN agencies, and in so-called inclusive consultation spaces, I don't think the problem is that digital governance processes get it wrong. I think the problem is that they're working exactly as designed. They were built to simulate inclusion, to absorb dissent, and to avoid redistributing power. That's exactly how they were supposed to work. We've been told that the system is under pressure, but the real issue is that most frameworks were never designed to withstand any pressure. They were built to protect coherence, not to absorb conflict. And they collapse the moment that the consensus is challenged. So governance today rewards coordination over any sort of contestation, and it centers alignment over possibly enforceability, and because of that, enforcement is exactly where accountability goes to die. So the real power sits upstream in how mandates are defined, in questions we were asking, who drafts thresholds, and in which enforcement tools are allowed into the architecture and which aren't. And in nearly every process I've been part of, that layer is locked before any participation begins. And if we look close enough, we can see that the real governance arena is not anymore tied to sort of like closed-door negotiations. I think Steffi brought a really important number here on lobbying, and lobbying is also on Google and Microsoft sponsoring privacy conferences. It's in multi-stakeholder panels where I've sat where Palantir executives talked 1 hour about equity. It's on Oracle authoring democracy roadmaps. So lobbying doesn't whisper anymore. It performs legitimacy and increasingly with our own language. And institutions fall for it. So how do we redesign this? Not by inviting more people to the polluted river. We need to structurally rewire where agenda setting, drafting, and enforcement power lives. So I think that, first of all, we have to stop confusing access with agency. Participation without decision-making power is containment. If you're invited to comment as an INGO, but not to negotiate, you're not really shaping that policy, you're just legitimizing it. Second, we need to invert the burden of proof. Once again, right now, marginalized communities have to provide research, impact data, emotional labor, and maybe even some trauma receipts to be taken seriously. Meanwhile, platforms self-report compliance and face really minimal scrutiny. In every other high-risk industry, in pharma, aviation, food, we assume that regulatory oversight is essential. We don't expect people to die to then start regulating it. Why is digital governance still built on trust? And third, I think we really need to build structural memory into governance. When frameworks reset every political cycle, communities are forced to reprove harm again and again, and institutions get to rebrand without changing anything. That's a system calibrated to exhaust the energy of those seeking justice and protect those delaying it. We're seeing right now with DSA enforcement and how it's always up for more consultations and more negotiations, and how X is never going to get charged because it's always, for the next appointment. So the question isn't really just how many stakeholders were consulted. It's whether the system still functions after 2 election cycles, 3 leadership changes, and a coordinated disinformation campaign. Does enforcement still activate? Does accountability still hold after that? So, of course, I can't explain how to do that in 3 minutes. I think I'm already up my time. But you can definitely engage with organizations like Equilabs and myself. I think I'm very fun in policy meetings. But in the end, I think governance is never only about process. And I think that that's something that these conferences sort of get stuck to in the processes, when actually what we've been naming here is power. Is power in different parts of society, and how we can rethink that in order to build better governance, to build better lives. And if we don't confront the political economy of how our systems are built, we'll keep stigmatizing exclusion and calling it governance.
Yikes. Following the conversation on power, safety, and protection by design, children aren't just being regulated. They're also exposed to harmful content that directly affects their well-being. Manon. We know that many children face mental health challenges made worse by what they see online, especially when algorithms promote control around self-harm, hidden disorders, or fear. How should digital policy respond to this kind of emotional harm? And what would real protection for children's mental health look like in these spaces?
I think it's a very important question, right? We hear a lot about the mental health crisis and how it's all linked to social media and how we should then respond with social media bans. But I think the online environment does play a role in the results that we see in mental health for many different reasons. Persuasive design may be one of them. If you're stuck to your computer, if you're stuck to your phone, if you're stuck to your iPad, then that means that you don't necessarily sleep, which is essential for your mental health. It means that you might not necessarily go out and exercise or socialize or do plenty of other activities that are essential for us as adults for our mental health, but are sometimes even more essential for children as they are, developing and growing. You've also talked about, recommend the system, but I think there's also advertisements, for example, right? The amount of ads that kids see online and how those ads can also be problematic, or, promoting products that are harmful for children as well. We also have the role of influencers, which can be force for goods, but also sometimes really force for bads, and can be problematic in terms of shaping, unhealthy habits, being in terms of dieting, over-exercising as well, but also just in terms of, having a kind of a social comparison that is constant, and that can be very problematic for certain groups as well. And then the recommender system. And I think we've mentioned them quite a few times because they have a huge role as to what we see online and how much we see. And I think there is not only a question of, which kind of content you see, but also how much you see it. So sometimes a piece of content in itself may not be problematic if you only see it once, but the fact that it's, accumulated over time and that your feed is constantly bringing you, maybe self-harm content, then that's going to be very problematic, right? And as a kid, you're curious, you want to, go and see what's out there, and, you might hear that one of your friends is having a mental health issues, and so you might go online and look it up just for you to actually learn and understand, right? And then suddenly your feed will be, constantly giving you information about that, and that information will be more and more extreme, and that may lead to then self-harm content, etc. So the recommender system here is crucial and can have a really bad impact on mental health. And I think, the good news is, and we've been talking about this, is that there is by design solution. If we see the problem as being design features, as being recommender system, then you can actually tackle those. It's not impossible. And I mean, I think as civil society, we've been bringing those options for a while now to the front, and I think the issue is, indeed on how you enforce them and how you make that happen. But those options are out there, and I mean, one of them is ending persuasive designs. I mean, as a kid, you should not be receiving notification when it's 2 o'clock in the morning, especially when those notifications have nothing to do with, people that you're following or about a friend reaching out. Sometimes it's just like, oh, I don't know, like I remember when I received like Facebook emails that were like, please, like, look this up, and you're just like, I don't want to, I'm, just sleeping. So there's like those basic things that you can do to actually stop, bringing you back. In terms of the recommender system, I mean, there are people like Panopticon, I know, who are there, like, have done a lot of research on how you can make your recommender system better, but it's just simple things, right? Ensure that your recommender system does not actually promote harmful content onto children, like, basic things, right? Make sure that your recommender system actually gives you a variety of information. Don't make sure, like, doesn't loop you in just like one thing. Stop like repeated exposures, and then also prioritize explicit signals, right? So we know that how it works right now is just they're gonna figure out what you're gonna look at the most, and that's gonna keep you entrenched in the design, in the platform, but that's not necessarily what you're the most interested in actually doing, right? I mean, you might be very interested in, I don't know, learning more about feminism, but you also like watching cat videos. And, the cat videos are gonna keep you glued to your screen for the entire day, but that's not who you wanna be, right? And so as a user, I think that's where it becomes to the crucial part as well of agency. And I think that's right now, that's what we're missing as well in those digital platforms and services right now, is like, you have very little agency, right? Those recommender systems have been designed. You go there because, well, all of your networks are there. So you want to be on Instagram because all of your friends are on Instagram. You want to share your pictures. You want to be part of that, right? And so you're going to be, having to deal with the recommender system that was designed by Instagram to keep you there. And I think that's where we want to see more agency for people as well, because as you also, presented in the question, mental health impacts are different from one person to the next. I mean, we've been talking about how, depending on your experiences, you may have a very different online experience. Is the same for mental health, right? If you have some pre-existing conditions, then the impact of being on social media or video games or whatever it might be very different for you. And so having that agency is really crucial to make sure that you can, give people the possibility to actually tailor their experience to what they know they need the best, right? If you're somebody who is, I don't know, has had a lot of bad experience with, dieting, for example, you might want to decide that you don't want to see content on dieting, right? And you should have the ability to do that. You should have that possibility. So I think having, really user agencies about having those features really like ingrained in the platforms is really critical to really help people also with their mental health. And I mean, going back to that, I know we're being, it's a hard panel in the sense of like we're bringing forward a lot of the, the problems that we see and very big problems that we have to deal with. Some of those measures are actually within the guidelines on Article 28. I know it's only guidelines. I know we need to see, how it's going to come in terms of compliance from companies and enforcements. But we, as an organization, we've been working a lot in this space, right, for a long time. And I think you just seeing children's rights being so critical and so up to the core now of the debate is already a bit of a win for us. So having those guidelines actually setting out, those things, you need to change your recommender system, I think can be taken a bit as a win. I mean, we'll see how we get there. But I also wanted to go a bit back to the question that you asked me before, because I think I missed a crucial point as to why we don't want, exclusion. Only, and also, relating to feeling unsafe and what do we mean by safety. As an organization, we've always been talking about children's rights online. And rights are very broad, right? We're talking about the right to participation, the right to privacy, the right to be heard, the right to play, which is an amazing right that only children have, but they have the right to play online, right? The right to be also protected from commercial exploitation, from sexual exploitation, and what we want is a holistic approach, right? You shouldn't just pick and choose which one you're going to focus on, but you should provide for a space where you actually, building on all of those rights and making sure that all of those rights are respected. And that's why excluding or just focusing on one part of those rights is not going to give us the adults that we want for society, like the actual young people that are going to be, I mean, some of us are here, we're not children anymore, but the people that are going to be sitting at that table next time. And that's also why we want to focus on mental health at the end of the day, right? I mean, we're talking also about the next generation of political leaders. So if you have people that are constantly glued to the screen, that have issues in terms of attention, concentration, then what are we doing about talking about competitiveness if, we won't necessarily have the people the next day to actually bring that forward?
And I mean, just like popping on to your point, I'm like having kids on the table and not their parents deciding on their behalf. Because a lot of conversations this morning that I've been part of or listening, every adult was like, I'm a parent and I want my kid to have this and this and that. I'm like, how about having your kid tell us what they want instead of you? I'm like, I mean, you want to be a good parent, sure, but how about being a good parent and ask your kid? But also, by the way, the do not, I'm not interested button on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, it's not working. I've tried it many times. I keep getting triggered even if I put that. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just react to that? Because I think that's one crucial point is like make it effective because we've seen a lot of those things. I think there was also a panopticon review of like how this was working on Facebook of like, I don't want to see this type of content and then it doesn't work. So the solution exists, just please make it effective. And in terms of the parents, I think it's also, you know, a really crucial point. We see a lot of tech companies actually pushing parental controls as like, this is going to be the miracle solution. And all you need to do is actually have more monitoring just done by parents. It's not going to solve anything. Parents are already crumbling around I don't know how many things. You also have the issue per se of how invasive it is for any child to actually, you know, have their parents be looking over whatever you're doing. You're also talking about marginalized communities. Some kids don't necessarily have, you know, parents, so not a solution per se. And I think then again, it's just a way to displace the problem onto somebody else. You know, the issue is not how we're designing a product. It's just, yeah, no, you just need more parenting, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, all of you. But before we jump into the audience questions, I want to take a moment to zone out. In a word where Mark Zuckerberg is calling for more masculine energy across platforms, where AI continues to reinforce segregation and exclusion, where online spaces often mirror the same violence we face offline, how do you individually or with the communities you work with take a step back? How do you crave out a moment of care for yourself and for others in the midst of all of this pushback? Rita? Spotlight again, sorry.
Okay. I think, well, for me, first on a personal level, it's always been dance. I think that sometimes we think that the spaces where things happen, we need to process in those same spaces so that online problems have online solutions and offline problems have offline solutions. Not always, and our worlds don't get divided like that anymore. So sometimes things that happen offline can be helped or solved somehow differently with technologies or online, and things that happen online can be dealt with differently or cared for differently offline. So I have a dance group, and it's all of us were queer women, and so from time to time we get together and we shake it off. We first talk a little bit about like our experiences we've had, especially this past 2 years. But then after we kind of get together, we discuss and we dance. I highly recommend everyone to move their bodies once in a while, especially because we're sitting down in front of technology all the time. And then the other thing, very briefly, is that actually a big part of what we've done in our work has been on like doing a lot of social media analysis on polarization. So we developed our own tool called Phoenix. We do social media analysis, and then with young people, we create groups of people that understand those narratives and together create new narratives that are so spaces for care between each other, like what I do when I dance, but also to actually do something against the things that we find online. So that's me.
I mean, I think I won't be, you know, mind-blowing in that answer, as in, I think more or less what you said, right? Disconnecting is super important, and I think that's something we tend to forget in our very digital bubble, but even, you know, for children, I mean, what you need sometimes is just, you need to be off of screen, you know, you need to be doing other things, you need to be playing outside. And I think for us as well, that's sometimes what we need to do, right? And then I think just to gather together also, I think, you know, having this community, having this panel right now is, for example, a really good example of how we fight back sometimes, you know, of just you need to gather, find alliances, and then just keep on moving and keep up the fight.
Yeah, very, very similar. Anything I can do with my hands that physically stops me from picking up my phone is only a good thing. Intentional moments with community, cooking for others, caring for others, as much time in nature as possible, and very, very lucky that the majority of my day that is spent at work, I work with great people. Yeah, and like Rita said, it's been an exceptionally difficult 2 years of watching a live stream genocide, and I think a lot of us have made ourselves very, very ill not being able to, I mean, understandably, drag your eyes away from some of the worst things we've ever seen. So, yeah, as much care and community as possible.
Beautiful. I think we've been sold this idea that self-care is about warm baths and scented candles and the masks. And of course, don't get me wrong, I love all these things, but for me, care isn't about escaping, it's about returning. It's about returning to the people and the values that I care so deeply. It sometimes isn't soft, sometimes it's strategic. It's knowing that your friends who are also activists have your back when things go wrong. It's knowing you can go to the group chat and be like, oh my God, something really bad happened, like let's organize. So yeah, for me, care isn't about isolation, but really about interdependence.
I mean, using your form of care and going back to the people, now it's time to go back to you and hand you over the floor and, yeah, ask us, comment, whatever. You're welcome to join the conversation in the last 15 minutes that we have. Any questions? You can raise your hand and then we have a mic. All right, we have one in there and another one in there.
Hello, Wojciech Wiewiórowski. I'm the European Data Protection Supervisor, and of course the parent, the father of two teenagers. I have rather request than the question to Steffi. Could you please repeat once again, because I think it should sound, why asking the ID from the child is dangerous and why it is wrong, because these are the obvious things, what you said, but you said it in 2 sentences, the way that I would like to hear it again.
Yeah, of course, EDPS, I'm very familiar with your work, big fan. Yeah, basically it goes back to what I was trying to explain before, is interrogating what we think security means, which for some, there is this very knee-jerk reaction, understandably, of protecting children at all costs. But again, what does that mean? Which children are you protecting? There are plenty of young people across the age range of youth that rely on anonymity in online spaces, in online communities, in forums and debates, where the anonymity protects their defining characteristics in a way that's not really possible in the real world. As much as possible, you can be anonymous online. I think that's only a good thing. I think we very easily fall into this trap, this zero-sum game of maximum protection means, as much censorship as humanly possible or as much transparency as humanly possible, but we know that doesn't work for some people, and others rely on it greatly to do their work, to simply exist, to simply enjoy an online space which should be as democratic as possible. I hope that clears it up.
Have one in there?
Hello, thank you for your discussion. Yeah, and I have question. To be honest, I couldn't address you to the certain person, but my question is about considering some recent proposals from some European countries to establish the European-wide minimum age for access to social media. Potentially it will be up to 15 years. And we have also another example from Australia, which restricted access from children up to 16 to access the social media. And how do you assess this proposal from European countries? Is it like proportional in addressing some risks, or it can have some negative consequences? Thanks.
I guess this question is mostly aimed at me, which I'm happy to take on. So you're right that we're seeing a lot of proposal, I think, across Europe, but more broadly, indeed, in Australia. on social media bans. I think a lot to take overall, coming back to my point of, I think it comes from a place of frustration about the state of the online environment, and about really a want and a need to do what's best. Even though maybe not with the, the most perfect solution. But I think it comes down to this place of like, we just cannot accept the way the online environment is anymore. And I think, also coming from the digital community, we have been trying for years now to change it, and with very little success sometimes, or just, moving the cursor a tiny bit to a little bit less, bad than what we were seeing before. And I'm just using the words of Lynn that I'm seeing in front of me right now. So I think there needs to be a focus on also just building, right online spaces for children rather than just excluding it. Because from a rights perspective, you just don't want to exclude. I mean, also, what does it mean exactly? Why are you choosing which age, first of all? How do you define social media? I mean, a lot of the arms that we see online are not only about social media. I mean, that's, one of the places where we see it, but then do you define YouTube as a social media platform? For example, in Australia right now, they're having the discussion about, well, actually, it's more educational. Yeah, but a lot of the issues that you see on YouTube, you see them across, typical social media platforms. So how do you define each of those points to actually make sure that it works, right? We see a lot of issues regarding video games, for example, which are right now like not necessarily addressed, right? We see a lot of issues on education technology, which a lot of them also, data protection issues. So it's not necessarily like the right focus. And I mean, I think, for us as Five Rights, we've always been like, the technology per se is not the issue, it's just the way you design it, right? The issue is not that children can connect and talk to each other. I think everybody can agree that more or less it's a good thing, right? I mean, as a kid, as a teen, you enjoy just being able to actually talk to your friends after school, talk about your homework, talk about what happened. Like, it's a good thing in itself, right? Like, that's what we want to do as human beings. We want to connect. That's a good thing, but just the way it is now being done, that's what is wrong. And I think, that's the whole issue of what we have been discussing now, is the whole issue of power, is the whole issue of the fact that you have very few actually, very big companies that have a hold on us and that decide on like how we connect for which means and how that connection actually means. And that's what we should focus on, rather than just excluding the technology altogether.
I mean, all right, I have a question there. You do.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Michaela Sullivan-Paul. I'm with the European Institute of Public Administration. First and foremost, thank you so much for this amazing panel. It's so amazing to see folks like yourself on this main stage. In this conversation about online spaces being harmful, I'm also curious about your perspective of online spaces being that of a mechanism, a vehicle for democratic participation, for inclusive conversations, for participatory governance, for instance. So my question to you, the whole panel, if willing, is what kind of conditions and criteria do we need to see, whether it's in big platforms, VLOPs, velocities, but also these smaller kind of spaces of the internet to make them inclusive, to be able to have these digital town halls, let's say, and then what criteria or conditions are needed to transform kind of the conversations and the discourse happening in these forums into actual kind of change in policy. Big two questions. Feel free to.
I have a very impulsive reaction to that. I mean, just because I've been having this conversation recently, I'm like, what democracy? What participatory democratic processes that we have in online spaces? We saw that when Trump was elected. I mean, the AI, diversity, inclusion, and equity was immediately dropped. So the time you dare to write a comment about racism and hold systems accountable, your comments get hidden and your account gets suspended. We see this also with the ongoing genocide. If you dare to talk about that on social media, your account gets suspended. Talking back to Europe, recently Sex Work Europe organization, they signed a petition and they submitted it to the Swedish government that they were taking some decisions on sex workers and digital spaces. That petition didn't do anything because the government didn't consider that. So I think the question is what democracy and not how we use democracy in that space, at least from my perspective. But I'm sorry, I used some privilege in here to talk. Go ahead.
I think, first of all, hi, Michaela, very nice seeing you here. I think when it comes to policy and sort of like our lived experiences and how our lived experiences translate to policy, I think in order to sort of to tackle exactly what Yassine said, which I agree completely, we have to regulators have to really understand what happens in digital spaces. And what happens is that whenever you try to voice online your concerns, and as soon as it sort of like gets a little bit out of like the mainstream discourse, be it you try talking about Palestine, or you try talking about feminism, or even politics, your account will get shadow banned. And that's really a democracy oversight here, because what is shadow ban? It means that the voices are going to be taken down, and that's suppressing rights, basically. So I think that policy really needs to meet action for us to feel like digital spaces are safe and democratic. And I think that this ends up helping everyone else. There is this recent statistics that came out lately, which said that Gen Z and millennials are much more likely to fall for disinformation online than boomers, than elderly. And I think that's super counterintuitive, because we're like, oh, what do you mean? I think, my grandparent is always falling for disinformation, but actually, no, it's young people. Because we're really in the eye of the storm, we are being targeted with disinformation campaigns from a really early age, and it gets really hard to decipher what is true and what is not when this is all you see 24/7. So I think that, yes, I'm not dismissing online spaces as spaces for democracy and spaces of deliberation and choice, but I think that we really need to have a better conversation in between regulators. Oh, 5 minutes. In between regulators and young people and not so young people, to really reframe this as a democracy arena.
You would like to
just very briefly, thank you. Just to say, I think we've all been talking, and there's been a lot of talk about platforms, recommender algorithms, like bridge building. How do we shift the things we see, this information, how that affects democracy? But sometimes I think we forget that technology is a tool sometimes, and there are other technologies, like deliberative technologies, think Polis, Ramesh, Talk to the City, a lot of technologies that are created to deliberate. They're specifically done with specific configurations that people can propose, upvote, do different things, that some activist groups use them. Some, I know, government processes have used them to get views of people that they can't all fit in a room and that wouldn't access, or who want to be anonymous, and then they can in those spaces. So I think sometimes we also need to look for these things that we don't think about so often. They're very easy, very simple technologies that can actually help us take a bit of a step forward, even if they're not a shiny solution, but they help in getting people to talk in a different way. Yeah.
Just because that was a perfect question, does anyone want to jump into it as well? Or feel like, okay, last question. Is there anyone who would like to take the floor for a last question? Going once, going twice. Seems like not. And we came to an end to this panel. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Steffi, Luisa, Manon, and Rita. What an honor and privilege to sit with you in here. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your conference. And also, thank you, Edri, for giving us the space to be as critical as we want to be. Thank you, Ella. Thank you, Janine.